Hello, welcome everyone to the CoStar Network webinar. We'll start to kick things off. So thank you everyone for coming along to the July edition of the CoStar webinar. We've got two really interesting presentations today. First of all, Susie Ilic from University of Lancaster and Serena Pollastri, also from Lancaster, will be talking to us about crafting the shore. And then Professor David Paterson from University of St Andrews will be talking to us about sustainable management of UK marine resources programme. So again, I'll just give a little pause there for people to join and remind everyone that the session today is going to be recorded. So we're recording it live, and that will be available on YouTube for people to see afterwards. So that we can share that with the wider part of the community. And at the end of each presentation, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions. So I would ask, if you have questions, if you could please write them into the chat. You can obviously write them into the chat at any point during the presentations, and I'll collect those questions that people put in and put them to our speakers. So any questions, just use the chat function and you'll be able to ask them there. But I think we've given time for everybody to join. So we're going to start off with the first presentation. So first presentation is about crafting the shore. So Susie and Serena are going to talk to us about that. I shall stop sharing my screen and then pass it over to them.
Just say hello to everyone from ourselves.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Serena Pollastri.
And I'm Susie Ilic. And we will talk about crafting the shores today. I'm just going to switch off the camera, but we are here with you. So we're going to start with this first slide that it's well known to all of you, but this just kind of gives us a little bit of context that, with climate change, we are going to experience more pressures of rising sea levels around our coastal communities. But what we don't see here, equally, our coastal habitats are under pressure from rising sea levels. And it's something that we should be aware of, because they are providing quite a lot of important services for us, but also important habitats for natural nature. So what the motivation of this project is then to look at whether we can work with the nature, whether we can provide some soft engineering techniques to, in a way, manage and protect those environments. So especially if we're thinking about losing them in next decades. So we are working with Lancaster City Council, and we are focusing very much here on looking the possible regeneration of lost salt marshes. And ultimately, that really aligns with the wider approach of living with water.
And one of the things that we started looking at when we started this project is the way in which really natural disasters such as Hurricane Katrina, which you can see here in the picture, taught us that predicting coastal flooding using only technical or physical approaches does not work. And we need a more holistic and human-centered understanding. What you see here is a quote by Nancy Tuana, who in her thick description of Hurricane Katrina picks out on how things like race, community situation, policies really impacted the ways in which coastal communities have been affected by flooding. So Hurricane Katrina, in her description, is not only a natural disaster, but it is a disaster because of the way in which it interacts with all of these structures, like policies, communities and race, which we always think about as abstract, but that in reality they have very material and generative effects on what happens in the context. So what we thought was, how about we try and flip the narrative? So if communities and policies and things that we make on the coastline really do have an impact on what happens, can we use these as a resource? So can we design small-scale nature-based solutions that can be produced and managed by local communities or using resources that they have available? So rather than large-scale interventions that need a lot of support, can local communities do something to sort of help create, support resilience and adaptability of their coastal environment?
Okay, so in that way, really, we are trying to support building not just coastal resilience, but also community resilience. And so our study site is located in the Morecambe Bay, which is the second largest bay in British Isles, with a very high tidal range, above 8 meters. And it's well known for its cyclic movement of river channels, which in turn results in cyclic marsh erosion and generation at decadal scale. So Hesbank, which is here on the map, really a small village, and we have just some delineation. It's lost its salt marsh somewhere between 2004 and 2010. And some of the living communities there are now vulnerable to coastal flooding and erosion, but also the mainland to Scotland, to Glasgow, their supporting structures as well lost the important buffers. So, but what it's really encouraging there, that some of the Spartina anglica, so the first pioneering plants, some of them appear there to start to build the tussocks, and then the Lancaster City Council start to think how to maybe support or facilitate spreading or regenerating salt marsh there. One of the things here is, and we deliberately put this map, is that what you see is a series of lines. So when we talk about shorelines, we often think about the line which delineates land and water, and often is perceived as being static, but we know that it's actually quite dynamic. And so what if we were to look at the shoreline through a prism of wetness? So Philip da Cunha seeks to move beyond the artificial binaries of land and water and argues for a more integrated and adaptive approaches to ecological design and governance. So working with wetness rather than trying to contain or eliminate that wetness. So moving from that delineation. And coastal wetlands and salt marshes are a really great example where that wetness content moves from 100% to zero. So it creates a zone of wetness continuum. Now, management or regeneration of salt marshes and other wetlands as well is very challenging. And there are many factors that need to be taken into account, or many factors that influence salt marsh existence. So something from sediment supply, we need to have enough sediment in the system. There's also hydrodynamic forcing, and especially the inundation time, which kind of brings us down to elevation of mudfloods, but also other factors like nutrients, organic matter, and also biological properties in that sediment that we need to take into account. So it's very, very complex, and there are no strict or clear guidelines of how to regenerate salt marshes, and there are many different approaches, and you can find that in the fantastic book on salt marsh handbook. But what we are showing here, one of the approach that it's trying to facilitate regeneration by connecting tussocks. But what that requires, it requires some monitoring of and local knowledge of how the system works. It requires some of the experimental work that we are going to show here, and then monitoring how that works. And with ultimate aim that these tussocks will enable tussocks to connect and making a larger patches.
So as you've seen in the previous slides, the strategies that we are testing out is, can we create small-scale structures that can help these tussocks to connect effectively? And we've done this in the Coastal Nature Lab, which is an experimental project that investigates the benefits and viability of using locally sourced natural materials in the design of locally relevant interventions for coastal protections that are, and this is crucial, co-created with local communities. So we started out as a pilot project, as a collaboration between us at Lancaster University and researchers at the University of Strathclyde, and it was funded by the IPACT network. It was then supported by our Future Coast in Lancaster, Lancaster City Council. This is a project that's funded by DEFRA and managed by the Environment Agency. And finally, it was also heavily supported by a group of master students who you will see the names here, Charlotte, Nicola, Stephanie, and Josh, who took part in the monitoring of what's happening in the project. So what did we do? So as an approach, overall, we adopted a collaborative approach. But we engaged the group in different ways at different stages. So we started with a process of co-design. We wanted to create these structures made of natural materials. And we worked with craftspeople who are experts in working, as I said, with these natural materials. This was the design of the sediment traps. And we developed some initial conceptual ideas into material structures that consider the technical aspects of craft production and what we know about coastal processes. Then we brought these designs to the local community. And local communities were involved in co-producing these structures, as well as later on in the deployment and monitoring of the structures. And some people took part in all of these activities, and some of them jumped in and out. Some of them only did the workshop, some of them did only the monitoring and so on. This was an iterative process. So we went back and forth with the design a few times, and we also always list the saltmarsh as participants, because the reason why we iterated is that sometimes things didn't work because the context in which we implemented wanted to do something different with them. The saltmarsh, in a way, participated in shaping what we did as a process. And these are some examples of what we created. These are sediment traps. We worked with, as I said, craft practitioners to design a portfolio of structures for sediment trapping. We chose to introduce craft as a practice for two main reasons. One of them, because through craft, you can work with natural materials that are not standardized, they are not modular, you kind of respond to the materials themselves. But also because with craft, we were able to engage with the dynamic environment of the coast. So when you make a structure through craft, you can adjust it, you can tweak it, you can adapt it to your abilities, but also to the specific needs of site. What was the rationale for the design? We engaged with artists, and you can see here a quote by Caroline Deere and Martha Orbach, who are two artists that we work with. They were in deep conversations with us. They did their own research on salt marshes and coastal environments, and we discussed different design strategies. So they looked at rhizomes, they looked at structures that exist in the natural world, and we tried to replicate these structures into the shape and the strategies of the sediment traps that we created. And then these were co-produced with communities. So we invited the artists. So it was Martha, Caroline, and then Amy Gunawan. And Alan Jones, to deliver workshops with local communities to create some of the traps that we then deployed into place. Some of the people that came to the workshops were primarily interested in learning a new skill, but what we did in this workshop was also to create an environment and a space for people to start observing, start discussing patterns of climate change, possible futures, share their fears, their knowledge, and so on. Then we deployed the structure into place, and we conducted some some monitoring over the following months. And here you can see some pictures of the structures in the sand after a year from their installment.
Yeah, so again, important is that, as Serena said, that we had a great help from communities to come out and to deploy these structures, and they were deployed and in autumn, last September, actually, in a larger, a little bit larger scale, and mostly really between TASOC, as we mentioned earlier. So then it was about monitoring the forcing around and the how the structures are performing in the field. Namely, really, we look at the changes in elevation around them. For this, again, we used low-cost methods with aimed at those methods then can be used by communities or by NGOs, for example. So we used mini buoys that probably a lot of you know about, so to measure the inundation time and also the currents and orbital velocities at the bed. And we then used smartphone app, in this case, Caniverse, to use structure for motion and to map the elevation changes around. As you probably know from original TASOCs, that there are natural TASOCs, there will be this interplay between the scouring and infilling, and that's also what happens with these structures. So it's really important to monitor that dynamic. So this is just showing a little bit that we also evaluated the methods that we use. So we used this very online, freely available app on the smartphone called Scaniverse, but then we compared the results from that scanning or that mapping with a little bit more sophisticated structure from motion techniques that we used previously for research here at Lancaster. And the results are quite good. I mean, we get less detailed models from Scaniverse, but that's to expect because they're very quick and use low images, number of images, but there are differences about 2 centimeters, and so very useful again to monitor just this dynamic between scouring and infilling. Now, I think with this system, really what we try to say to communities that they are very sensitive systems, they need care. So this kind of nature-based solutions that might be used for coastal protections are not like seawalls. And we often use this analogy in conversations with community and practitioners that when we build seawalls, it's almost like a building a house. They are there, we maintain them, but we don't need so much maintenance. Whereas if we do nature-based solution, this is almost like building our own gardens. It needs monitoring, it needs care, it's constant look for changes and addressing those. So it's a very different environment, very different approach that we are moving and shifting to in coastal protection. I think what you'd like probably to hear what we learned from this pilot project. So on structure itself, did they work? Okay, so I think positive is they sustained several storms through last winter. They start to be colonized by algae. They are having potential for trapping sediment, but there is still a way to go. We did compare them on the same site with commercially available biodegradable structures, BESE. So BESE were also on that site, and we saw some of the plants already growing into BESE structures. This didn't happen yet in ours. But what is the advantage of this structure is that they were co-designed and co-produced with community. So we had a full engagement of community from the beginning. And it's something that Serena said, by monitoring what was doing, we could go back and change some of this design. And that's what we are planning to do. So it's very adaptable. On co-design, what's really important, and I said it probably the largest impact from this pilot is engaging with local communities. It created a very safe space to share the ideas, concerns about climate change, about coastal protection. It was very important for the community to learn in a very relaxed atmosphere and non-patronizing atmosphere about the processes and a future of the coastline. It also created the atmosphere of people being really confident to share their ideas. And so we had already some proposals that they might like to take it forward themselves. And this is really what we want to do. We want to empower the community to start to think about their environment, to take actions for themselves. So in that way, we think that's a very useful project. On co-monitoring, as I said already, those kind of methods that we used are really low cost, easy to apply, easy to use. And again, importantly, these kind of images or the data from mini-buoys can be analyzed again with a free software. So everything is there available for communities or NGOs to use freely. Okay, and we're finishing now.
Yeah, so what we are doing now is we are collecting all of our learnings into a visual handbook that will be hopefully at the printers in the next couple of weeks. We call it an open handbook because obviously our learning process is not finished, and we are really looking out for other ideas on how to improve on the design and how to push this idea forward. So if you are interested in learning a little bit more about what we've done and what we discovered, there's a QR code there that you can take a picture of, or you can get in touch with our using one of our emails. There's going to be a physical copy of the handbook, but there's also going to be a digital copy that will be live on our website after we produce it. So I think that's all from us. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you very much, both of you. That's a really interesting presentation, and I look forward to seeing the open handbook. That looks like a really interesting output from it. Be interested to look at it. Got one question already from the audience. How easy was it to work with marine licensing process to be able to implement deploy? Was that something straightforward or perhaps not?
This is a very good question and very important question, and we need to stress that all of these employments and all these projects need really marine license. I mean, maybe not marine license from MLO, depends where the project takes place, but it's definitely very important to discuss the project with Natural England. And we did it because it's a pilot project. I guess we had, quite quick process. But developing projects like that on a larger scale probably would require a little bit more elaborative work to show that there is no impact. But as I said, we were really working closely with Natural England, and we had a great support, and I hope everyone else who is going to take similar projects in future will have similar support.
And we got confirmed that we needed permission from them rather than marine management.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. We were very lucky. We needed only Natural England permission for this. But I think it's very important to work with colleagues. from Natural England in the very beginning.
Yeah. I think I just had a quick question that maybe builds on that, or maybe you could say whether it would, maybe part of that answer says whether it can or can't happen. But you obviously had really good engagement with the community in the workshops, and we're giving them some practical skills. And I partly wondered, did people go out and build their own structures with the workshops, or add to it in some way, or perhaps should they not go and do that? Maybe does it have to be something that's part of an organised activity?
Yeah, you can answer that.
Yeah, so what we did in the project is we did workshops where we were building structures, and then those structures built in the workshops were the ones that were put out in place. Yeah, theoretically speaking, one could then go home and make a basket and put it in the water. We wouldn't encourage that, just because you know, there's an element of the permissions that we got, but also monitoring and being very careful in the way in which we chose the site where to anchor things. But all of this, it's something that if people came to the workshop, we discussed this with them. So we made them aware of the complexity of the process. So to my knowledge, I suppose our knowledge, like nobody went off and made error. But the part of the spirit of the project is and part of the reasons why we want to publish the handbook and make it public is that we would like to encourage other groups, maybe NGOs, researchers, charities in other coastal communities to undertake a similar process than we did, with all permissions and you know, the kind of strong rationale to try variations of this in other coastal communities. Yeah, that's something there.
Yeah, I think, you know, here we were leading on it. What we would like to do is like NGOs or communities leading it. But then again, it's really important that, you know, all these different organizations are involved.
Yeah.
So just like we did, but it's almost like we try to step back and then have those really community leaders taking forward. But
yeah. Good. Interesting comment as well about a project that maybe has some similarities about building islands from shifting sand. So there's a link there that people might want to look at. But just finally, maybe briefly, David's asked a question about, was there any opposition locally or?
No, I don't think we came across on that. But we should say as well that this project, when it started, there is already the larger project, Our Future Coast, was already started. And so the Lancaster City Council already had consultation sessions, open cafes, and so on. So there's been a lot of discussion already what they would like to do. So it was probably not a surprise. So I guess in environments that might not be happening, it's probably something worthwhile considering as well. And I imagine that's again importance of, you know, involving everyone in
one thing that we were quite conscious about is that we were worried about people walking on the beach and seeing the structures and thinking that somebody, like, there was some rubbish there. So we tried to make the local community aware of what was happening, and part of it was done by the city council hosting events where we were also invited to participate, but also proper signage that described what was there, why is it there, and what we were trying to do.
And then again, volunteers in the field who were just taking care of all of this. So as I said, we had a really good support, and I guess probably going back to importance of involving all stakeholders from very beginning. We had a luck that's done for us a little bit. Yeah.
Great, well, that's brilliant. Anyway, thank you again, and a round of applause from here. Great presentation, really interesting, and thank you for sharing that with us. And look forward to seeing that the handbook, and be great to sort of publicise that when it comes out as well.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, no, thank you. Okay, so we're now going to move on to the second presentation. So David Paterson from St Andrews is going to be telling us about the Sustainable Management of UK Marine Resources Programme. So I shall stop sharing my screen and hand it over to you, David. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, well, first of all, many thanks for the invitation to speak to you today. So I'm just going to try and run over some of the main points of the Sustainable Management of UK Marine Resources Programme. It's a lot to do in the time available, so forgive me if I can't cover everything. But what I want to do is talk a little bit about its inception, what's actually happening under the programme, and some thoughts for the future, which are the three sort of elements of the talk. So we'll start with the Sustainable Management of UK Marine Resources Programme. This was a programme which was designed to think about problems of management in coastal and marine systems. And it had the highlights of to try and improve understanding of perspectives and behaviours concerning the marine environment. So not just the science, but the social dynamic as well. And try and integrate this new understanding or better understanding into systems-based approaches that support the development and analysis of interventions that would need to be made to improve management. And that leads to informing effective decision-making. One interesting thing about this programme was that it was funded under what was called the Strategic Priorities Fund. This was very much intended not to be business as usual. The idea of this fund was to fund strategic areas that would not be funded under normal UKRI Blue Sky research programmes. So one of the really strong features of this was that there had to be outputs that could be recognised and used. And so that was one of the things that was a major effort in the programme. So it was not UKRI business as usual. So what do we have to deliver? Approaches and scenarios that take account of all values of systems, new tools that could be used by the stakeholders that had to be embedded in the development of the projects, recommendations on future policy, because obviously as you investigate these areas, then opportunities to improve management are outlined. And so that was an important component, which I'll come on to a little bit later. And then breaking down barriers between academic disciplines. We're always talking about inter and transdisciplinary research. We're not always very good at delivering it. And perhaps the coastal region is one area where social science, marine science, and economy should all come together quite strongly if we're going to manage these systems better than we do at the moment. So the programme did attract some interest. There was about £10 million of funding available. And it was an interesting process to go through all of the applications. There were 71 expressions of interest, which led to 43 full proposals, of which 6 were funded. So if you think of the person hours that went into producing all of this documentation, to produce 6 funded programs is an interesting way we spend our time, but it's quite common in the research community. There are 64 research organisations and HEIs involved. And I put this diagram up, and then just as you were talking at the beginning and somebody mentioned this being recorded, I actually blanked out the names just in case anyone got upset or offended by the fact that there were some organisations who were using a shotgun approach, putting in as many proposals as they could, whereas others were being much more targeted. So I thought I'll leave that to your imagination, which organisations were contributing to over 50 proposals and which organisations contributing to less. I suppose it's no problem really that some organisations have skills across those kinds of areas, and so it's probably to be expected that some organisations will want to be involved in more proposals than others, or maybe targeted by groups that are putting together the proposals to become members. So the lucky winners, there were 6 major projects funded. These were, quite eclectic across a group of different areas. For instance, Pyramids of Life was particularly mathematical, modelling, looking at fisheries. Then we have restoration of seagrasses with RESO. And then ones that are more akin to the kind of programme of COSTAR, which would be sustainable and resilient coastal communities, marine spatial planning, co-benefit solutions for resilient coasts, and then one which was more towards the social and arts side, which was integrating diverse values into management. In addition to those core programs, there was also funding for what you might call the wider community, or what we called the SMMR net, which was to provide information, dissemination, and opportunities for people to get together who weren't necessarily involved in the programs, but had an interest in coastal management and planning. So the SMMR net program, and here I have to thank Chris Ioni, who did a lot of the work on this, included things like this, seminar programs, but also training issues and the development of ideas that emerged from the networks to say, can we do this, can we do that? And also to support integration among the projects. And one of the innovations that was quite interesting was the Ocean Partnership. And this was kind of like speed dating for anyone who was interested in marine systems. And I took part in a number of these, and you could be talking to a fisherman from Orkney or a member of the European Parliament, depending on what session you happen to join. And the way it worked, and still works, is that you have a 10-minute presentation at the beginning, only 10 minutes, and it's just on some subject. And then people who are signed up for that particular program are put together in one-to-one groups where they can talk for about 7 minutes and then decide if there's anything they want to follow up or just learn. And sometimes students would come in to talk about their research work and maybe learn from people with more experience in that area. Or it might be two people with an arts background and a science background talking about how they might interact over the coastal area. And these were actually quite good fun and led to some serious connections, which was extremely beneficial. So this is just an example of one of the trainings that was offered, skills for interdisciplinary research. And some of these were popular enough that they were sold out, so to speak, and that we had to run sessions a couple of times. So I think one of the lessons that we learned from the SMMR programme was to try and broaden the dissemination of the work, because there are people out there who are interested, who maybe aren't in a traditional pathway to join things like UKRI programmes. And in addition, we ran an annual meeting, which was usually down in Bristol, and got the community together. And one of the interesting things about these meetings was, because stakeholders were very important in the formation of the projects and were always deeply embedded in the programs, then we got quite a balance of people coming to these meetings. It wasn't just academics, it was also NGOs and government who attended, and DEFRA was a strong representative there. So that was one of the initial challenges of the SMMR programme, was to identify these groups of individuals with particular skills and try and bring them together in a network. You can play with this if you want. If anyone has access to the Pure system or our Google Scholar, then you can look for networks, and you can do that over time. So you can follow how networks are expanding with particular programs. As an example, I did it myself, so I was able to show that during this period of work, then there were many more connections that I was making within a personal network. And I'm sure that applies to many of the people, if not all of them, who were involved in the SMMR programme. So the conception of the programme was outside the normal, and it was very much to bring government and stakeholders into the work. And also very much about delivery. These programs had to deliver something. And as I mentioned, there was also the implications of helping to develop policy. So these are the funded programs here, and these are the program leaders. The team is far too big to go through everybody, but the leaders of these programs were Claire Evans, Louise Evans, Anna Queiroz, John Pitchford, Laurent Amaudry, and Steve Fletcher. And I'm sure they would all love to hear from you if you have any comments about the work they're doing. So what I'm going to do is just mention a couple of outcomes. And as I said before, it's what is produced in these programs that's important. So if we look at ROC first, the resilience of coastal communities, they spent a lot of time developing ideas around how to manage systems and looking at the best possible methodologies for that. And one of the ones they strongly supported was the MAPTA tool, which is a marine planning trade-off analysis tool, but it's developed at a level that is easy to use. It did exist before the program, but was then very much adapted towards the kind of situation arriving around UK coasts. And so a low-tech participatory management tool to allow stakeholders and academics and government to work together, thinking about the trade-offs that are necessary in managing coastal systems. So their key policy recommendations at the end of that work was to innovate with more streamlined and integrated policy and to reduce regulatory pressure on marine users, to develop tailored support for marine users, and to facilitate access to social support networks and organizations. And that might tie back to what Suzana and Serena were talking about earlier. Establish thresholds for unacceptable trade-offs that breach environmental boundaries. And that was one of the reasons I asked the question about opposition, because we sometimes are given the impression that if we all meet together and discuss things, it's going to work. That isn't actually the case, that sometimes you need some way of making decisions like MAPTA in order to at least be clear on how the decisions are made, but they may still have to be enforced. And the reality is that not everyone will be happy. So then moving on to MSpace. MSpace again was looking at particularly marine spatial planning, and particularly to do with addressing climate effects, looking around the coast of the UK, looking at areas, how they would change with climate, and looking at areas that might be more resilient or perhaps more resistant to the problems of climate change. They worked very strongly with the Marine Climate Change Impacts Partnership, producing infographics like this, which helped give an idea of what climate-smart management of UK seas would look like. And again, this is a tool that can be used and is already being used by some organizations to help them in their understanding of the management of the marine systems. Their ideas and policy were to make marine plans spatial, to further develop spatial plans around the UK, and empowered with the authority to actually influence decision-making and licensing processes. We might suggest that this is really in its infancy, bringing all of these aspects together. There are certain areas where it's done quite well, but there's still a lot of work to be done there. And that will lead to integration of marine planning into sectorial policy and to build a UK community of practice and maybe make the UK one of the leading nations in terms of climate-smart marine spatial planning, and to be able to communicate that and perhaps share it with other people. The Pyramids of Life was slightly different. It was a more mathematical program. In a sense, they were developing better models to understand fisheries pressures. And so to do that, they started out with developing improved models, which were more involved with multi-species analysis rather than looking single species yields, etc. And they developed a MISR model to help improve multi-species modeling. But in addition to that, they were looking very strongly at what fish people ate and why, and that there might be an opportunity to educate, might be a strong word, but suggest to people that some of the common fish species we eat are not the best ones in terms of removal from the food chain, and that there could be other subjects, other fish that should be used that would be more ecologically sound and sustainable into the future. And they did this working with a number of local areas, but particularly the Celtic Sea fisheries management plans, looking at multi-species modelling and helping to update evidence around what consumers thought. They did quite a lot of work in universities, sort of in university canteens, trying to influence what students were using as a sort of selective body to look at the effectiveness of what they were calling nudge behaviours to move people away from the common fish that they ate to the ones that would be more sustainable. So their key policy recommendations, which you would probably be unsurprised at, would be to embed ecological models in fisheries policy and to move beyond single species frameworks into the kinds of MISR models they were developing. And support behavioural interventions for consumers, that is to nudge consumers towards those more sustainable seafoods. And I know that they were talking with some quite large consumer producer companies to think about how this might be implemented and worked on in the future. A project that has a lot of charisma at the moment, I guess, around the UK is the restoration of habitats. And the RESO project was particularly looking at the restoration of seagrass sites and under the title of Restoration of Seagrasses for Ocean Wealth. And there's a lot of consideration about the benefits of potential habitat restoration, and this might lead into discussions about marine net gain, offsetting, etc. So what they were doing under this programme was, first of all, establishing where you might not be able to establish seagrass beds or promote the development of those that already exist. And to do that, they developed a tool which is available on the internet, which was known as the SEEDS tool. And that helped with the ideas of what would be the right conditions and what might be the best places to begin to work on these things, but also using case study sites where seagrass is found and where sites are already being restored. And I said this is quite a big political issue at the moment because we are looking, and many companies are looking for ways of promoting their restoration. And marine net gain is not an easy topic. And so this may be seen as a solution to some companies to help with such restoration. So their key policy recommendations were to address barriers to restoration, bottlenecks in licensing, etc., and conflicts, as I've already mentioned, and also to increase financial investment in restoration, and that might be through things like marine restoration funds, as suggested by some organisations and being developed down south in England. One of the interesting projects that was more outlined perhaps to the normal scientific process was diverse marine values, which was integrating diverse values into marine management and talking about the arts and humanities more strongly than we have done in the past. And I would recommend accessing their website to see some of the things they did, including theatre and arts, but also photo essays and other landscape work. And they did this in different areas around the coast, from Portsmouth to Shetland. And these are fascinating voyages into people's perceptions of the coast and discussion about coastal management and change. And that was highly valuable also to the other programmes because it led to some discussion and integration of that kind of approach into the other work packages and other projects, which was extremely valuable. And their key policy recommendations, unsurprisingly, to integrate diverse values into decision-making, to build structural capacity for transdisciplinary and co-creation, bringing communities into the participatory methods in order to understand and help shape policy outcomes, and reform government structures to address fragmentation of marine policy that they believe hinders the inclusion of less economic values and more social and societal values. And the final one is Co-opt, which was Resilient Coasts, and was looking particularly at the balance between hard coastal defences and softer green solutions, and also involving local communities in thinking about and deciding on those possible options. And so developed modelling packages and soft modelling to help understand those different pressures. And their recommendations were better integration of system complexity and interactions, and looking at multiple types of flooding. Improved treatment of uncertainty, and scientists aren't very good at that. You know, we're asked about our recommendations, but we're always, you know, careful to say, well, this isn't final, or there's some doubt in this. And that's sometimes I think we have to be a wee bit stronger and you know, help to make decisions rather than just always provide so balanced accounts. And that might be a bit controversial. And a more nuanced consideration of future scenarios in the design of soft defences. What are those soft defences that are more in keeping with societal desires of the local coastline, but also deliver the protection that's needed? Not an easy task. So those were the programmes, and I'm delighted to say they all seem to be delivering well and working very hard. And it's always the case that at any programme you look at, it always has to be ambitious, because in order to be funded, you have to show quite strong ambition. So to reach those targets in the period of time is quite impressive. One of the things that might have helped with that is, of course, is that a group, a couple of people were appointed as champions. I don't particularly like that term, but really promoters of that programme, and to act as intermediaries between the funders, the UKRI, and also the programme PIs, which allowed for a sort of discussion of options to take place both ways before proposals were made or systems were changed. So I'm very briefly going to go through the lessons that we learned from that process. I think one of the big things was to have these regular meetings with the PI groups, which were quite informal and could discuss issues and problems and opportunities. And that helped promote interdisciplinary work among the programmes, because the PIs met and discussed things together. And that did lead to some direct collaboration between MSpace, RESO, and other programmes as well, particularly diverse values. So that helped evolve these programmes in a very positive direction. One of the other things that was unusual about this programme is that the funding was divided into two packages. So the first part of the funding was to really achieve the project aims, but then a second tranche of a year's funding was provided to make those aims work, to give them to the community, to work with the stakeholders, to get them nearer to the point of which they could be used by those groups. And I think that has been a successful way of helping to handle that. And our job throughout is, every time we discuss with the PIs, the focus on outputs, what usable products will actually come out. And just to show you some of the interactions with UKRI, we had to have a risk matrix that we went through on a sort of 6-monthly basis, updating it, thinking about the achievements of each of the programmes, and also looking at the risks as they change with time. Things like change in stakeholders, usually quite a high turnover of staff, and therefore you had to keep working to keep the stakeholder engagement going. So lessons learned, and this one's obvious: don't start a large collaborative research programme during a pandemic. We couldn't really avoid that one. To engage as early as possible with the so-called policy customers, including in the selection process, and keep doing so because staff change. Include a number of non-academic reviewers who have particular experience of what the customers need. What are those needed products? And that discussion isn't held often enough with these projects. We try to help in minimising delays. Sometimes delays in recruitment and in getting projects going did affect the running of the programmes. And that had to be allowed for and mediated for. The two-stage funding process I've mentioned was very successful. And we think that making sure there was clarity in the roles and responsibilities of people at programme level and at UKRI level, and to maintain good communications across the board. So the first thing is to thank all of the programmes that worked extremely hard to achieve these quite difficult objectives. And I wish COSTAR success in continuing that work, and also looking at that balance between society, humanity, and policy that is needed to properly run coastal systems. And finally, to our contacts at NERC and ESRC, Jessica Surma and Andrew Telford, who helped and were very adaptive to requests from the programme. I'll stop there, and I've just have to mention that the whole thing is now under review, and so it'll be interesting to see what a review panel says about how the work was completed. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Dave, for a very comprehensive overview of a very large and extensive project. Well done for doing that so concisely.
I don't think I did it justice, sadly.
Well, I think there's probably many talks there really to unpack all the things that you did, but really interesting. We've got a little bit of time for questions, although we are coming up close to the hour. I was just wondering, maybe sort of you pointed out lots of things that you thought that worked well and some lessons learned. But what would you say was the biggest success overall?
I think the biggest success was the flexibility of both sets. I think usually when you get a research programme, you've got your objectives and that's what you target. This time, it's very much about successful output. So that communication between the programmes, the stakeholders, and flexibility on the part of the funders to recognise that was really critical. And I think that was slightly unusual.
Yeah, definitely not what we're familiar with as business as usual. So you were definitely doing something different from that, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, for people here, definitely go on to the SMMR website, because that takes you to all of the individual programmes. And the outputs were just too much for me to cover here. Yeah. Well, things like MapTown, Seeds, and Miser tools that are all being developed under this programme. It's also very useful for teaching. So, if you're teaching students about, coastal management, etc., then it's quite a useful resource.
Well, no, that's really good. And I think we're almost out of time, but thank you again for a great presentation. And I think we should probably have some people back from the projects, and maybe that's something that we talk to you about, get hear some more detail about some of the things that were in each of the individual projects. That would be great.
That would be a great outcome.
Yeah. Thank you very much again. Cheers.
Thank you.
Good. Okay. Well, just to wrap up, if I could just share my screen again, and just let you know our next webinar will be in September, and the speakers for that and dates will be announced to everybody shortly. So hopefully everybody here is subscribed up to the COSTAR network, so you'll see we'll send out details of the date for that, and who'll be talking in the next few weeks. So thank you very much again, everybody, for joining us. It was great to see so many people here. I hope you enjoyed both of the presentations. They were really interesting, and lots learned from them. So it's just my screen's not changing. Again, thank you for joining us, and thank you again for the presentations. That was really great, and I'm pleased everybody could join us and see you again in September.